scripture reading for this morning comes from John chapter 2, verses 13 through 22, and I'm reading from the Common English Bible translation this week. It was nearly time for the Jewish Passover, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. He found in the temple those who were selling cattle, sheep, and doves, as well as those involved in exchanging currency sitting there. He made a whip from ropes and chased them all out of the temple, including the cattle and the sheep. He scattered the coins and overturned the tables of those who exchanged currency. He said to the dove sellers, "Get these things out of here. Don't make my Father's house a place of business." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Passion for your house consumes me." Then the Jewish leaders asked Jesus, "By what authority are you doing these things? What miraculous sign will you show us?" Jesus answered, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up." The Jewish leaders replied, "It took 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" But the temple Jesus was talking about was his body. And after he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered what he had said, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So today, it just happens to correlate with the big game, but we're going to start with about 4 pages on brisket. Is that okay with everybody? We did wine last week. Figured we'd go to brisket this week. Any barbecue fans out there? Anybody hate barbecue? You could probably run to the restroom and get another coffee if just give me 3 minutes. I love barbecue, although recent blood work says I should eat less of it than I do. One of Kara and my favorite activities up in Athens was an annual barbecue festival. They would have like 50 or 60 contestants. Some of them were real chefs that had a restaurant, and some of them were home smokers. Wait, is that the term for it? Anyway, you had to cook home smokers. Where did that come from? You would cook pork butt. You couldn't use sauce. You could use rub if you wanted. No sauce. You couldn't cover it up. It was basically who was skilled at smoking a pork butt, and it was awesome. It was so much fun. Because I like little pop quizzes and tests. There's 4 major genres or styles of barbecue in America. Does anyone know the 4? Kansas City, Memphis, Carolina, and Texas. There you go. Texas. There you go. I don't 100% know which is which, so I'll just tell you I lean pork over beef. Anybody pork over beef? Yeah! Who are the beef fans? There's like 3. There you go. I lean sweet versus mustard or vinegar. Anybody sweet sauce people? Yep. Anybody who's the vinegar saucy people? Yeah, I could tell. I knew that, Sherry. I could tell. Mustard sauce? Now, here's where we find out the people we might have to have pastoral counseling with. Anyone do the white Alabama sauce? Yeah, mayonnaise on, it's just weird. Okay, and for sides, I love my carby sides. I know some people like a fresh, like coleslaw, but give me the cornbread, even the white bread, French fries, fried pickles. Can you see why the blood work turned out the way it did? But as it often happens with food, some of our most beloved and endearing food trends actually don't start in the culinary academies or the fancy kitchens or descend from, palaces, but they rise up from the bottom. You can go to Maitland right now and pay like $50 for 1 roll of sushi, but sushi was street food. It was the food of the working class. Same with tacos. Isn't it ridiculous how much they charge for tacos some places? Tacos were just like the simple thing. That was what people put together. And actually the same is true for the centerpiece of Texas barbecue, which is brisket. Brisket. It comes from the front part of the cow, and it is one of the, we'll kindly say, one of the more affordable cuts of meat. And that's because it is simultaneously, and this is a paradox, simultaneously fatty and tough. How does that happen, It's like fatty, so people who are healthy don't want to eat it, and it's tough, so you have to cook it for a long time. And so when you mix those things together, it lowers the price. And it is the centerpiece of Texas barbecue, smoking brisket. But what I'm about to share with you is that smoked brisket didn't actually start in Texas as barbecue. It started coming out of another cultural cuisine. Does anyone want to harbor a guess? That's right, Jewish. Maybe you grew up in a Jewish family, or you knew a friend who was Jewish, or maybe you've just watched like The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel or some other TV show featuring a Jewish family. You know that they cook brisket, and they cook brisket a lot because, like for us, we have turkey at Thanksgiving or ham at Christmas, which our Jewish friends definitely don't do. For them, their big holiday meat for like every holiday is brisket. And I don't know about you, I harbored a little bit of jealousy of my Jewish classmates growing up in school because they were like out of school for a holiday. It felt like every other week. There's so many holidays in the Jewish religion. And in fact, they have a weekly holiday. Does anyone know what that weekly holiday is? The Sabbath, yeah. Maybe we should take some notes from our Jewish brothers and sisters. They have a weekly holiday, and for some of them, they do a brisket every week, kind of like the Sunday roast over in the United Kingdom. Some folks do the big brisket every week. And due to modern day kosher laws, the back half of the cow is largely off limits. There are things a butcher can do to make it kosher, but that raises the price because it's extra steps. So as you're choosing from the front half of the cow for the Jewish populations growing up in America, the Jewish immigrants, this was the perfect balance of cost, quantity, and flavor. And of course, they would just throw it in that oven, low heat, and let it go for forever so that it's time, and so it's tender by its time to eat. One Jewish commentator called it the most important cut of meat in North American Jewish culture. And while most Jewish families they braise it, they started smoking it in Texas. And they think it's because the interaction of Jewish immigrants with the Native Americans and also immigrants from Mexico and Central America and South America, because smoking meat was such a big part of their culture. And so they started smoking brisket and putting it in Jewish delis and restaurants decades before it became a part of the barbecue scene. And what's funny to me is if you have a cut of meat like brisket, as long as it's relatively fresh and you put it in for a long enough amount of time, it's going to come out good because it's just good. But even with simple things like this, everyone has a little trick, you know? We all have our little tricks for different recipes, even the simple ones. Well, I rotate it this way, or I start it at this temperature and then I move it to this way, or I put it in the fridge for this long and then I do that. We've got all these little proprietary tricks. And what's interesting to me is that brisket is actually the centerpiece of one of the most famous culinary fables, and it has to do with a newly married Jewish couple. It was the first Sabbath after the wedding day, and the wife wanted to impress the husband. This was the first Sabbath, so she was going to cook a brisket. Well, she cooks the brisket the way her mom taught her. She brings it to the table. They get partway through the meal. She's like nervous. She said, "Honey, how is it?" And he says, "Darling, it's wonderful, but where did the ends go?" She said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "The ends are the best part." She said, "Well, I cut them off." He says, "Why did you cut them off?" He said, "Because that's what my mom did." So they got through dinner, got all the cleanup. She ran upstairs and got on the phone and called her mom. "Mom, why do we cut the ends off the brisket? My husband says it's my favorite part." And she says, "I don't know. That's the way my mom taught me." So then she hangs up, and who does she call? Her grandma. She calls Grandma. "Grandma, why did we cut the ends off the brisket?" What did Grandma say? You know the story. "Our roasting pan wasn't big enough." I cut the ends off because the roasting pan wasn't big enough. There are lots of variations of this story with lots of different meals from lots of different cultures. But in the Jewish culture and in the Jewish setting, the fact that brisket is the holiday meal adds an extra level of depth to this fable. Because for us, Thanksgiving is a holiday, and we as Christians certainly add our faith to it. We express gratitude to God, but it is a civic holiday. But all of those holidays in Judaism are religious holidays, and they are meant to remind us and teach us stories about God and God's relationship with humanity. And so this idea that as we're celebrating this holiday, we are going through motions that we've been taught, but we don't know why, becomes a problem, right? I mean, if you cut the ends off a brisket, you might miss the best part of the meat, but you still get a meal. But if you're doing a religious practice as perfectly as you've been taught, but you don't know why, you might end up in a little bit bigger of a problem. And of course, this is not an issue isolated to any one religion or any one decade of time. If we look in the Old Testament in particular, Amos chapter 5, God says through the prophet, I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. In the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals, I will not look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. And this ends with a quote famously used by Martin Luther King Jr., but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. One of the themes in the prophetic book of Amos was that the nation of Israel was really good at festivals and following all the details. But their life outside of the festivals reflected nothing they were supposed to learn from the festivals. They would hold these big parties and they would follow everything to the letter, but then their life outside of it wouldn't reflect what God was trying to get them to do. And in fact, Amos specifically accuses them of hating the ones who speak the truth, afflicting the righteous, taking bribes, and pushing aside the needy. There was a complete disconnect between what the traditions meant and what they were supposed to form inside of people and the way they actually lived their lives. Now, this is also a central issue for us as Methodists, both at the beginning of our denomination and what John Wesley feared would be the end of our denomination. Did you know that Methodism started when a couple of college kids got bored in church? That's literally how Methodism started. There were some college students who were going to church and were bored out of their minds, and so the only thing they had to do in church was what? Read the Bible, because that was the only thing there in front of them. So they would pick up the Bible, they would start reading the Bible, and they would read all these stories about the powerful movement of the Holy Spirit and all the exciting things that were happening in the early church. And they were like, why isn't this happening now? And so one of them, named Charles Wesley, went to his older brother John, and they said, well, let's get together and let's try doing what's in here. So they started reading the Bible, and they started praying, and they started serving the poor, and they started visiting those in prison. And they started doing all of these things. They worked on what they called their method. In fact, Methodists was an insult early on because their friends were like, you have this method for getting right with God. But they began to experience the presence of the Holy Spirit. Methodism is a renewal movement. Our job as Methodists is to remind ourselves in the world why God calls us to do this, what the point of all this is. And John Wesley's biggest fear, which he shared before he died, was that Methodists would preserve the form without the power. Because he knew even the method of Methodism could become an empty ritual. We could forget why we're doing it. We could go through it just to check the boxes. We could go through it just to do what we've been taught to do, but miss the power and presence of the Holy Spirit, which was the whole reason we got together in the first place. But of course, the challenge is this drift away from the point. It happens oftentimes slowly and subtly, one decision at a time, over time, and every decision along the way seems to make sense until you back out to the 30,000-foot level and realize you're nowhere near where you started. Have any of you ever tried to write on unlined paper? Anybody take notes or journal or address a letter, which is like a paper thing that you put in a box and then some magic creature comes and takes it and puts it. If you've ever tried to handwrite on unlined paper, what happens? You think you're writing straight because every letter is next to the next letter and every word is next to the previous word. And then you zoom out and what happens? You nosedive. You think you're moving in a straight line, but you're not. That's kind of how it works over time. So let's jump into today's story and see maybe where things went wrong. It was nearly time for the Jewish Passover, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. He found in the temple those who were selling cattle and sheep and doves, as well as those who were involved in exchanging currency sitting there. So just in these first two sentences, we already have at least four things I want to note for you. Number one, it's Passover. Is Passover a big festival or a little festival? Big festival, right? It's one of the big ones. It would be, you might call it the Super Bowl of Judaism. I don't know. It's just like, it's a big holiday. It remembers God delivering God's people from slavery in Egypt, right? That's what it's meant to remind us of. And I say us because we are grafted into the people of Judaism. I am not Jewish. As far as I know, I don't have Jewish heritage, but I'm going to say us throughout this message, even though it's a little weird. Secondly, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Why do we say up to Jerusalem? Because when we look at the map and Jesus goes from Galilee to Jerusalem, we think he's going down. Of course, they didn't have maps or MapQuest or Google Maps or Waze or all that stuff. Why do we say up to Jerusalem? Elevation goes up, sure, but was Jerusalem the highest mountain in that area? No. But it was considered the highest place. Why? Because what was in Jerusalem? The temple, right? The presence of God, where heaven and earth overlap. So Jesus goes up to the temple. And in the time of Jesus, the practice of Passover required all able-bodied men and their families to travel to Jerusalem. Earlier, it was an at-home festival. After the temple was destroyed, it returned to an at-home festival. Maybe you've been invited to a Seder in someone's home. But during this part of Jewish history, during this part, all able-bodied men and their families were supposed to come to Jerusalem. So it was overflowing with people. Thirdly, they were selling cattle, sheep, and doves. And I know, just like last week, you're itching to dive back into Leviticus, but please resist the urge to pull out your phone and just reread Leviticus right now. Hang with me, okay? What were the cattle, sheep, and doves for? Sacrifice, right. And could it just be any cow or sheep or dove? No, they had to be what? Blemish-free, perfect, right? Blameless. That's A, hard to find, and then B, if you're traveling from who knows where, what are the chances that that animal's going to make it blemish-free? You might be traveling for days or weeks or longer. Something might happen. How many of you ever gone on vacation and you get like nervous at the airport, did I forget something? And then you realize, oh, there's like a Target everywhere in the world. If I forgot my toothbrush, it's no big deal, right? So some of this system was set up to where, okay, you don't have to bring yours. You just come to the temple and we'll have them for you. You can buy them when you get there, like the temple Target. But here's the problem. You're coming from all over the Roman Empire. Your coins might be no good with the people selling the cows, the lambs, and the doves, because you might come from some weird place where money's made out of something weird. So we're also going to help you by setting up currency exchange. Anyone go overseas and have to change your money? You do that. So it makes sense. Let's set aside the fact that we know in a minute Jesus is about to go all Indiana Jones on them. Just the first two sentences, does this make sense? If everything's run honestly. Yeah, this makes sense. We're serving people. We're making it easier for them to do what God is asking them to do. We are making this a welcoming environment. We are helping people do what we want them to do. And they want to facilitate this process. They want to make it easier. Now, an interesting thing. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell roughly the same stories about Jesus. There's some variation. John is completely different, but not completely. There are a few stories that are the same in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and also John, and this is one of them. This is one of the few stories that shows up in all four Gospels. So we can be like pretty strongly sure that this or something like this happened. But in those first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus' indictment of the temple is that it became a what? A den of thieves, which he was quoting the prophet Jeremiah when he said that. But that's not, did you notice? That's not Jesus' accusation of the temple in John. Now, were these people cheating the people coming to town? Oh yeah, absolutely, right? You show up with your blemish-free cow, they find one little nick on the hindquarters and say, well, I'm sorry, that's not right. You're going to have to buy one of ours. And oh yeah, the exchange rate's gone up because of supply, demand, all this stuff. Like, there was absolutely, I'm sure, grift going on, because if you can make money, you're going to make money, even in the church, unfortunately. But that's not John's version of Jesus' critique. This is what it says. Jesus made a whip from ropes and chased them out of the temple, including the cattle and the sheep. He scattered the coins, overturned the tables, and he said to the dove sellers, get these things out of here. Don't make my Father's house a place of business. Don't make my Father's house a place of business. What was the temple supposed to be? My Father's house, God's house. What had it become? A place of business. Now, I know that I ask a lot of questions, and oftentimes I expect you to answer me, but these, I'm just letting you, these are rhetorical questions, and I'm not even going to answer them. I just want you to wrestle with them for a second. What do you do when you go to God's house? What do you do when you go to a business? Are they the same? I went to Publix on my way in this morning because I knew it was only 20 minutes at 7 a.m. that the place wasn't going to be bonkers. But I can tell you, what I did there is not what I do here. What is the focus in a business? Who is always right in a business? I said you didn't have to answer, but some of you feel called by the Spirit to answer. Who is always right in God's house? Who's the focus in God's house? What makes a good business experience? What makes a good church experience? Oop, I'm getting ahead of myself. What makes a good God's house experience? What results are you expecting or hoping for, planning for when you show up to a business? What results are you expecting, hoping for, planning for when you show up to God's house? Now, of course, these aren't just questions for another religion 2,000 years ago, halfway around the world. What do we call it when we're trying out different churches to see where we fit best? Church shopping. We call it church shopping. And trust, I wrestle with this all the time. I don't talk about this a lot. I actually host a podcast for our denomination. Not Florida, Global Methodism. I am the go-to host for church marketing. I wrestle with this every time I sit down to talk to someone and try to work really hard to make it not sound like the church is just a brand to build. Church shopping. Okay, I could go on for 30 minutes. That's not the point today. Let's get back to our story. Now, of course, is it good that people are trying to do what God asked them to do? You can answer this one. We're back to answering questions. Is it good that they're trying to fulfill what God has called them to do? Yes. Yeah, it's good, right? It would be equally as bad if they were just like, oh, yeah, I know my goat only has 3 legs and is foaming at the mouth, but it's a goat. What do you want? It's not like God's actually going to eat it. Right? Why did God ask for a blameless animal or a spotless animal? Because that's something of value, right? Was the point of the Passover to get all the details right and check all the boxes so that you stay on God's good side? No. In fact, what does that actually sound like? It's almost as if we look at it that way, God has put a price on the relationship. And if you pay the right price, then you get the product. Maybe the temple becoming a place of business wasn't just the literal business, but the fact that the festival itself had become a transaction. Because what was this festival meant to do? What was Passover reminding us of? The Exodus story, of God freeing God's people from slavery, of God overthrowing and defeating the biggest, baddest world power at the time, Pharaoh and the empire of Egypt. It's something every year to remind themselves of it. And to remind themselves of how important it was, they were supposed to take their best animal, the biggest, best animal you had, because you gave up something of importance to remind yourself of its value. But it also wasn't just reminding us of the past, but it was also pointing forward to the future, when God would do this same work on a cosmic scale. God rescued God's people and then said, you are going to help me rescue the world, not from the powers of Pharaoh, but from the powers of what? Sin and death. God is going to do this again, and God's chosen people had a role to play. And so every year they were to be reminded of their history, their identity, and their purpose. This was not a transaction, but it had become an empty ritual. And not only that, but the leaders were essentially undermining and betraying the meaning of this festival by colluding with the Roman Empire that had invaded Jerusalem. And another example of, I assume I'm doing the right thing, but maybe I'm not looking at it from the right perspective. The leaders of the temple had all these deals cut with the Roman officials in order to keep the temple open, because they wanted to worship God, but in the Roman Empire, who was God? Caesar. Was it legal to worship anyone else? No, except for if you paid enough money. And so the leaders of the temple were colluding with the world power to try to save the temple and keep it open. Who are we supposed to rely on to save the temple and to keep it open and to protect the people of God? Is it the evil powers of this world, or is it God? They were literally undermining the meaning of the festival by the very way they practiced the festival. And so Jesus shuts it down. But Jesus only shuts it down temporarily. Likely, at best, this whole system paused for a couple hours. And they just waited Jesus out. They waited for him to leave. They cleaned it all up, and they set it back up. You know, every once in a while, you'll find people in the church that say, we should braid some whips and overturn some tables. And it's like, okay, but you realize it's like only an hour. And then it kind of went back to the way it was. Because you see, Jesus is not trying in this one act to overthrow the whole system. Because you can't fix systemic problems with just one act. Jesus is doing what's called a sign act. This is a symbolic act. Jesus knows that they're going to set it up in a couple hours and get it all running again. And that actually only emphasizes his point. What is the point of attention-grabbing acts like this? It's to wake people up to the systemic problems, because systemic problems can only be solved by systemic change. And systemic change can only be made by large groups of people who are aware of the problem. And Jesus is drawing attention to this problem in a very biblical way. All throughout the Old Testament, God called the prophets not just to speak, but he gave many of them the responsibility of doing some pretty crazy stuff to draw attention, to make sure that people would listen. One of the ones we talked about last year was the prophet Isaiah walked around naked for 3 years, saying if we don't change our ways, God's going to allow a foreign empire to come in and to take us all away into slavery, and we're all going to be dressed like this. And you know what? It happened. Nobody listened to him. we also said, we're both glad God hasn't called me to do that yet. And so Jesus' shocking sign is meant to fall in line with the Jewish prophets. He is halting the temple system on one of the biggest holidays on purpose, saying that this whole system should stop. And now notice what John puts next. He says, his disciples remembered that it's written, passion for your house consumes me. Jesus isn't doing this because he's anti-Jewish or anti-temple. He's doing this because he's very Jewish and very much loves the temple. He's doing this to try to save the temple. He wants the temple to be what it was supposed to be. Critiquing a system doesn't mean you hate it. It just means that you love it sometimes. And that's what the disciples got from it. But what did the Jewish leaders get from it? Then the Jewish leaders asked him, by what authority are you doing these things? Now, one of the interesting things is oftentimes the Jewish leaders don't understand what Jesus is saying or doing. And in a minute, they're going to, again, not understand what he's saying or doing. But in this moment, they know exactly what he's saying and doing. They have not missed Jesus' point. They know that Jesus thinks he's a prophet. They know that Jesus thinks he's speaking for God. And so if they agreed, they wouldn't need to ask the question, right? They're asking the question as a way of challenging Jesus. They are asking Jesus this question as a way of saying, you can imitate a prophet all you want, but you are not a prophet. Now, let's set aside for a second that we know that Jesus is God in human flesh. And let's just say that Jesus is a prophet. If the leaders of the temple cannot recognize the voice of a prophet, is this system salvageable? No. And that's what I mean when I said them setting it back up in a couple hours only reinforced Jesus' point. If they can hear the authentic voice of a prophet, and in this case, the authentic voice of God in human flesh, if they can hear the voice of God and immediately, without any question, without any pause, without any reflection, say, nope, you're wrong, we need to make our money, there's a problem. And if the leaders of the system can't make it work, then the system is broken. And in fact, they ask him, they say, what sign are you going to prove to us that you have the authority to do this? I love that. What sign are you going to show us to prove that your sign is a sign? All kinds of signs. And we learned last week signs are a big deal in the Gospel of John. There's 7 major signs that reveal Jesus as Messiah. The first one is turning water to wine. The last one is the resurrection, and Jesus is about to tell us about that sign in a moment. There's lots of little signs, but there's also an interesting interaction at the end of the Gospel of John where Jesus interacts with a guy that we know of as Doubting Thomas. He doesn't believe that Jesus is raised until what? He sees the marks on Jesus' hands. And Jesus says, I'm so glad that you asked, and I'm so glad that I could help you come to faith, but blessed are those who what? Believe without seeing. Jesus' goal, Jesus' desire for us is to be so familiar with God, to recognize the voice of God and truth, that we trust it when we hear it, and we don't need some miraculous sign to back it up. And here the leaders of the temple don't hear it at all. And so Jesus answers them by ratcheting up the conflict. He says, you want a sign? Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. And here the Jewish leaders and the disciples don't get it. Jesus is now speaking cryptically again. The Jewish leaders are like, what? It took us like 46 years to build this, and you think you can put it back together in 3 days all by yourself? But, reflecting back on this, after the resurrection, the disciples recognized that he was speaking about what? His body, himself. Jesus is saying to the leaders of the temple that you can call this building the temple, but it is no longer the temple. It is no longer functioning as the temple. What has become the temple? Jesus. The responsibility has shifted from the building to Jesus. This is not the first time in the Bible that this responsibility has shifted. Before it shifted to Jesus, it shifted from the first temple to the second temple. The first temple got destroyed. Then they rebuilt the second temple. One of the things you'll notice if you read the Old Testament closely is that the presence of God never returned to the second temple the way it was in the first temple. The first temple was filled with the glory of God. But that first temple, where did it get the responsibility from? What came before the first temple? The tabernacle, which was a mobile tent that held the Ark of the Covenant. That was where God's Spirit dwelt with God's people, and it moved all around. And if we go all the way back to the beginning, what was the big capital T temple that we talked about last week? The Garden of Eden, right? The tabernacle and the temple were decorated like the Garden of Eden to remind us of the place where heaven and earth overlapped, the place where human beings could be in the presence of God and be reminded of who they were and what they were supposed to do. That's the point of the temple. And Jesus basically says, okay, enough with this, all this system. I am now that. But this is not the last time that responsibility shifts. It actually shifts away from Jesus a little bit later in the Bible to who? To Jeremy. And us, too. It shifts to the church. Because the spirit that was in the Garden of Eden, the spirit that inhabited the tabernacle, the spirit that inhabited the temple, the spirit that inhabited Jesus, the spirit that raised Jesus from the dead is now where? In us, individually and collectively as the church. You are a mini temple, friends, and not just when you're in this room, and not just when you're tuned into the stream. That would be weird if only when you're watching a certain video on Facebook you became the temple. You are a mini temple, and we are the temple together. We're supposed to be the place where people hear the love and grace and mercy of God, to feel that invitation. We are supposed to be the kind of people who live a life that people see as transformed, one of hope. We're supposed to live a life that doesn't look like the ways of this world. We're supposed to live a life that says there's something different about this person. It's not just an earthly life, but it's one where there's something more, there's something deeper. That should be the why behind everything that we do. Without it, we will lose our way. But with it, we all become the place where heaven and earth meet.